Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We are going to be having a conversation with the Executive Chair of the Emancipation Support Committee, Zakiya Uzoma Wadada. There is the jump-off point. The premise is the Pan-African Festival, TT, but there's so much more to speak about. Looking forward to this one.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Definitely our pleasure. But even before we get into the festival specifically, it's been a while since we've spoken, and one of the things I want you to weigh in on this platform is the significance of a second decade of
For people of African descent.
People of African descent, please and thanks.
Yes, so the first decade was actually from 2015 to 2024. So the first decade ended last year, and then it was felt that it was necessary for a second decade. One of the major institutions that emerged out of the first decade was the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, which is a United Nations entity, but driven by civil society membership. And they advocated very strongly for a second decade because, it was believed that the full advantage was not taken of the first decade. Governments did not pay much attention to it, even though it was a decision of the General Assembly. And therefore, we thought that a second decade was critical as we continue to confront the legacy of colonialism and enslavement and try to ensure the human rights of Africans everywhere. So because the first decade was not as successful as envisioned, some things did happen. I'm not going to sit here and say nothing happened, because you do have civil society organizations who have worked really hard to ensure certain things happen. For example, even right here in Trinidad and Tobago, with respect to recognition, we were able to install 2 monuments. And one at the Yoruba village, and of course with the support of the government, arise in front of the Treasury building, at the Ministry of Community Development and Culture at that time. They provided funding for that. For the Yoruba Village Monument, we did get some funding from the governor of Osun State when he visited. He did contribute, and of course, we did get a lot of support from the Port of Spain City Corporation. So we were in Trinidad able to erect 2 monuments, which would have satisfied the recognition component of the themes of the decade, which are recognition, justice, and development. And of course, you have civil society organizations like ourselves doing work continuously that addresses the objectives indicated in the plan of action for the decade. So you've had civil society organizations continuing to work. We've had very significant activities taking place in different countries, particularly the removal of monuments, installation of monuments in Barbados, for example. And therefore, we've had some movement, but not as much as we think that is required. And there are some significant areas, particularly around justice, around institutional, racism, around decolonization, that we still need to address, particularly with respect to our education system, our travel. For example, we still, aviation routes, trade routes are still determined by patterns that were created as part of the colonial era. So there are still many issues that still need to be addressed. And therefore, we do have to work really hard and be more focused on ensuring that this decade is even more successful.
What is the significance of the theme for the festival this year?
Yes. So the theme that we chose is shaping sustainable futures through reparatory justice. So we are saying that our sustainable development goals cannot be achieved unless we have reparatory justice. Reparatory justice is fundamental to the whole issue of equity. It is fundamental to ensuring that some of the wrongs that continue to persist as part of our colonial legacy are corrected. It is important for us to really have a sustainable future for our people, all peoples. We have to correct the trauma. We have to correct that legacy of colonialism that still puts African people across the globe in a disadvantaged position that allows for continued racism and discrimination against Africans based on color of skin and hair. These things are still real, and they also form part, they have become so embedded in the psyche, not only of our colonizers, but of Africans themselves, that a lot of how it is manifested, is not in the best interest of our people. So we do think that reparatory justice has to be a critical part of sustainable development. So you notice that climate justice has also become part of the reparations conversation, because it is recognized that it is because of the what you would call it, the devastation of our lands by the colonial powers in order to extract, all the wealth and all the value from it that has left our countries in states that make them much more vulnerable to the variations of climate as is being manifested now, So all of these, so we are just linking that whole sustainable development conversation with the conversation on reparations.
How important is it to have one, and that reparations or reparatory justice, it feels as though that is something that goes back as well, because sometimes people just want to say, okay, well, put a full stop and let's start a new chapter, let's start a new page, turn a new leaf.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of someone talking about, it's almost as though you put a nail into a piece of wood, and they just pull the nail out and they say, let's go, without looking to fill that hole. And
exactly.
So how significant is it that there are levels that need to be gone? And because this is something that people get emotional about, and sometimes even use emotion as a tool to not deal.
Yes. I think we have to come to terms with our reality, and I think, yes, it is emotional. Some people don't want to see anything or hear anything about the enslavement experience. But the part that they are missing is that we are still living the trauma of that. Some of us have been able to overcome to a point that we can lead that process of full liberation and full emancipation and be able to guide, but many of us have not. Many of us are still feeling that we are not as good as other people. Many of us are still feeling that, we have to be totally identified with the values of the colonial era in order for us to survive. That we cannot be ourselves, that we cannot begin to find out who we are as Africans and try to manifest that in our everyday living. Some of us are afraid to do that. Some of us are, because we fear, just as in the days of slavery, that if you emerged as an African, you would be condemned, you would not be accepted, and so on. So you even find, like, for example, in our society, you find African businesses, for example, not necessarily willing to associate themselves with African events that says, okay, this is African. So you have this kind of very subtle ways in which we continue to manifest the trauma of our enslavement. Not believing in ourselves, not trusting ourselves, not understanding the power and beauty of ourselves, not knowing our history. Because if you do not know your history and you think that I am the descendant of a slave, not even of an enslaved person. Yeah, because we still refer to our ancestors as slaves rather than persons who were trafficked and enslaved. You see, so from the time you start, there's a need to actually change the conversation so that the understanding can come. Before enslavement, we had our own civilizations and our empires, and we had made a lot of advances in science and so on, which has assisted the world in its own advances in those areas of science and technology. But we don't know those things about ourselves, and then they are not taught in schools. So we talk about is what we talk about the decolonization of our education, so that we truly tell the stories of the peoples who live in this space. All of us, we need to understand these stories of all of us who live in this space and how we came to be here. You know, but the stories cannot start with indentureship or start with enslavement. Who were these people before that time? Which gives a different, and this is what we try to do, Dike, when we do our African history quiz, and explain to the children who they are, what are somewhere they came from. That creates a whole different sense of self among people. You understand? So, for example, what
And
is
just
driving?
before
Sure, sorry. Yes, go
just
ahead.
before you give me that example, because right now as it stands, we're going to have a big half and a small half. So we take a short break
Yes, that's okay.
and then we return
That's
for more.
okay.
Stay with us. We come back
No
after this.
problem.
Welcome back. We are having a conversation with the Executive Chair of the Emancipation Support Committee, Zakiya Uzoma Wadada. And I love the fact that we're having this conversation in May, because May feels as though there's so many levels of awareness that are raised looking at culture. And I even like the fact
Yes,
that you talk about, I know sometimes people think that to raise focus on one thing means that you need to remove focus from another. You just spoke, before we took the break, you spoke about the fact that where does our story start? And the fact that we
right.
cannot start with the story of enslavement, and that is different from being slaves. Some people even go as far as saying prisoners of war. It cannot start from the point of indentureship, and I and also there needs to be an objective look. So it's not as though, even taking emotions out of it, which is very understandably difficult to do,
Yes,
but looking and saying these are facts.
yes,
This level of colonization follows a playbook. If you look at the
yes,
fact that the way that the coconut oil industry was, people took hammers and blades to it in Trinidad and
yes,
Tobago, and even further afield until the industry was established elsewhere, and then you see
yes,
studies coming out and saying, no, well, coconut oil is real good, you know. And guess what? We
yes,
have it,
yes.
so buy it from us. And even
And now we can't even afford it.
looking at the
Yes,
textile
yes,
industry in India, where people
yes,
literally had looms broken, hands damaged, and so that that industry would go to where people would call more of a metropole, one of those
yes,
colonizing
yes,
powers, and
yes,
being able to tell
yep,
these stories and realize that there is so much shared history, but the fact that focusing on one point doesn't mean that other points are let go, as opposed to
oh,
a rising
definitely.
tide. And there's a level of appreciation, huh? Because I would
Yes,
say the first place I learned about the difference between banners in terms of spiritual Baptist flags and
yes,
jandis in terms of East
yes,
Indian or Hindu flags was in the same yard. But I guess Gasparilla could be a little different place too, but I give thanks for being able to think that
yes,
those things were just run of the mill and commonplace before growing up and realizing, okay, it's not so everywhere. But
yes,
anyhow,
yes, yes.
let me let you talk now. I'm happy to have the
Nice,
conversation
okay.
with
We
you.
are having a
Um,
conversation and you're making some really very important points, you see. And that is that the colonialism has impacted all of us. All of us, all of the groups that are here have been impacted by it. And that's why we have to examine how we think, what our worldview is. And that's why today we have talked about whether we should have a Caribbean Court of Justice or a Privy Council. You know, we still have these kinds of conversations. You know, we have our indigenous people who are here, and we still feel it is okay to venerate Christopher Columbus. All of this is part of that, what do we call it, remaining colonial, what do we call it, the colonial impact on our society. That people will fight for retention of Columbus. And people will fight for to ensure that we continue to have a Picton Street, even though they understand who Picton is. So I'm just saying, the naming of our streets, all of this is still very, very relevant. You know, even now on the continent of Africa, you still the same things that you talk about. People want to go there, take out all the minerals, you understand, and establish these massive industries from which now the same people on the continent have to now try to access at large, you know, exorbitant prices, and they themselves not benefiting from it. And then when you start to fight back against it, of course, you are labeled all kinds of negative things. So that colonial mindset is very prevalent still. And the worst part of it is how it has impacted we ourselves, you see, and how we respond to things. So I think that consciousness, that understand, and that's part of the reparatory process, healing of our own minds. You know, as Bob Marley would say, emancipating ourselves from that mental enslavement. It is still very real. You know, it is manifested in how our young people are dealing with each other with respect to crime. That is not an African a manifestation of African values.
But
That is
speaking about that, but speaking about the response though, we have about 3 minutes.
Yes, we have to talk about the festival.
So let us get some logistics up in this conversation.
Yes, I'm telling you. I mean, it is always so interesting because these things are so important to us to speak about. But the Pan-African Festival, TT Commemorating Emancipation, is a tool that the ESCTT uses to deal with all of those issues that we're talking about, because it comprises elements of culture, business, you know, education, youth. Yes, so we try to encompass all of the different aspects of our development as part of the festival. We launched the festival this year on the 25th of May, which is internationally recognized as African Liberation Day, now called Africa Day. It turns out to be the same day that they are now having this International Day of Solidarity for Ibrahim Traore. But we are going to, our event is in the afternoon at 5 p.m. so that you can go and support the solidarity events and still come to the launch of the festival at 5 p.m. at City Hall. We're collaborating once more with the City Corporation. We want to give thanks to the mayor for his continued support. And yes, so come and find out what's going to happen this year for the festival on Sunday, 25th May at City Hall in Port of Spain. Yes.
And where do individuals get more information? Because I know sometimes there's a level of attention that goes on different days. So if you want to talk about Indian Arrival Day, if you want to talk about Emancipation Day, but there's a lot of work that the ESCTT does throughout the year. Where do individuals get that information?
On our Facebook page, we normally have our monthly calendars to get people a sense of what is done every month. So we'll go to the ESC's Facebook page, Emancipation Support Committee, and then you can always have an update on what's happening. We also share a lot of educational material. You'll see all that is happening with us all through the year. And I'm glad you raised the point. We do not just awake in May. We've been working, we've had our regional competition for spoken word. People is here already. We launched our agricultural project. We've been doing a lot of work already for the year. But you know, the festival is our flagship, if you want to know, project. Is what people best know the organization for, but of course it's not the only thing. But we look forward to people coming out on the 25th at 5 p.m. at City Hall to join us as we celebrate African Liberation Day and also launch this year's festival.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your
Yes.
insight.
Yes.
Zakiya Uzoma Wadada, the Executive Chair of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. And on behalf of the entire crew, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.